Are you prepared to survive an iron rule scenario? Because if this whole global situation spirals out of control, there's a good chance that you'll have to. And being prepared for it now is the best way to minimize any risks that you might have to take during that time. Hey everybody, it's Magic Prepper. Today we're talking about surviving a martial law scenario and whether or not you're prepared for it. Yes, iron rule is often a synonym used for martial law. And one thing I found on this platform is that if I use certain terminology that might compete with any mainstream media narratives, suddenly the video gets buried because the information here is not valid or verifiable. So iron rule is another way to talk about martial law without getting flagged. And that's exactly what we're talking about here in this video. And if you want to prepare for the possibility of martial law and be ahead of the curve in case it ever gets declared, then hit the subscribe button below, because hopefully these conversations are going to help motivate you and give you good direction as to how you can prepare yourself both mentally and physically for said scenario. Now, is it impossible? Of course not. Martial law has been declared in the United States of America over 60 times, okay? So this is a possibility. It's not just something that we talk about in obscurity. It really has happened before. And martial law can happen locally or nationally. There's a lot of different ways it can go. The president as well as state governors have the authority to declare martial law, and they don't have to make a formal declaration or proclamation of sorts either. So that means you might not be aware of it when it happens, and no one really has to tell you, and we'll find out the hard way if we find ourselves living under martial law at some point in time. Now, what is martial law? Just so we can get in this conversation and have some ideas about exactly what we're dealing with here. Basically, it's a temporary substitution of civilian rule via military authority. So basically, the military takes over any governing aspect of the civilian population, and everything revolving around the legalities of operating as an American citizen has to go through the military at that point in time. Martial law is justified when civilian authority has ceased to function, or is absent, or is no longer effective. So these are examples of what we could expect when it comes to a martial law situation. And of course, with everything going on in the world and with all of the possibilities of global escalation existing right now, conflict can definitely drive martial law into existence. And we know this exists because back in World War II times, when Pearl Harbor was attacked, Hawaii went under martial law for 3 years. So if any large-scale conflict ensues and it affects us here on the mainland, you can expect anywhere from up to 3 years worth of martial law to live under. And by being prepared for it now, you can mitigate the risks of trying to survive a martial law scenario by being aware of what that could incur in the sense of how it will affect you and what you should prepare for in the sense of how it's going to change your life. Now, what could happen under martial law? What are some things that we should be aware of and just have in mind now so that way if they happen, we're ready to go? Well, first and foremost, curfews. So say goodbye to late night drives and say goodbye to your 24-hour drive through Taco Bell, because curfews are definitely going to be put into place during a martial law situation. So your ability to be mobile and move freely is suddenly restricted and limited to the point of only being during daylight hours. And that is a big deal. Now, of course, the curfew could be from any time to any time. So who knows exactly what time of day they would decide on based on your location. But at the end of the day, curfews are almost a guarantee during said scenario. So if there's things that you count on or rely on to exist during the nighttime, well, think again about that practice or about that job that you have that's overnight during this martial law scenario, okay? Moving on from there, you can also expect media blackouts. And what that means is that the media is not going to be reporting on every single aspect of what's happening around the world at that time. And this is why communications and networking is so important before something like this was to occur. We have to be able to give each other the information. We have to be able to talk to each other via radio or whatever other forms of communication we come up with. And we have to make sure that we can stay on top of the intelligence, because without it, we'll be in the dark and we won't know what's happening or whether or not it's safe to come out yet, basically. And that is something we should definitely keep in mind, because the media blackout is a guarantee during a martial law situation, because media outlets will be taken over by the military, and whatever information they put out is going to be regulated via the military. And you can see that there is a strategic aspect as to trying to limit the flow of information when you could have enemies from within trying to digest it. Things to keep in mind. Now, Another thing a lot of people don't consider about what's possible during a martial law scenario is the takeover of businesses. If your business becomes an asset or a strategic value for any kind of military operation, there's a good chance it might be taken over by the military because they decide they need it more than you do during that time. So this could apply to a lot of things. So I want you to keep this in mind, but grocery stores, restaurants, anywhere that has large amounts of food could definitely be targeted in this situation because we know food is control and we know the people are going to panic because supply chains and logistics are likely going to be hurt and possibly completely broken if we're facing a martial law scenario. And then the other thing with that you have to consider is things like gun stores, sporting goods stores, anywhere that you can get self-defense weapons or ammunition or anything related to being able to act out during a martial law scenario will probably be limited as well. So these are things that we have to keep in mind because if you have a small business and it has a strategic asset of some sort during any kind of a conflict scenario, you can assume that your business will probably be taken over during a martial law situation. So good things to know, and all of you who rely on small businesses for your employment or maybe grocery stores or anything else with value, you might not have a job during that time. These are just things you need to prepare for now. Plan for ahead so that way you're ready for it if it happens. Now, another thing that can happen is prohibiting sales of certain items. And that can go right back to guns and ammunition, of course, because for obvious reasons, right? But also can go to things like alcohol, tobacco, anything that people might find to be unnecessary during an emergency, or maybe strategically necessary for the military to have complete dominance over rather than you having access to it during those times. These are considerations you have to keep in mind. You might not be able to buy the stuff you were waiting to get during a martial law scenario because it might be locked down. Okay, moving on from there. They will take full control of hospitals and medical centers, okay? So if you end up finding yourself in a situation where first aid or medical care is necessary and you don't have a way of treating yourself, you will probably find yourself in the web of military law during that situation because when you go into the hospital, it's going to be under military control. When you go to a urgent care, it's going to be under military control. These are things to keep in mind because, yeah, it might not be a big deal depending on the situation, but if you're trying to avoid those interactions and you're trying to avoid having to be put on the radar, there's a good chance you just threw yourself right on it by going into the doctor's office during those times. So another reason why medical independence is such a big deal here in the preparedness community. Moving on from there, they can regulate wages, okay? And they can regulate working conditions as well. So what does that mean? Well, it means that if they decide that someone's overpaid or that everything has to be equalized suddenly, everyone's pay could be cut or raised or whatever they decide during that situation. So if you're a small business owner, suddenly you're paying everybody less money or you're paying everybody more money. Or everybody who is making less is suddenly making more at a large institution because of equalizing. Who knows exactly why they would change the wages based on the situation, but the point is that they'll have the ability to do that. And the same goes for working conditions. So they might say, in order to be at work right now, you have to wear full PPE, okay? And that's understandable depending on a scenario, right? But at the same time, they might come in and say, all right, the working conditions now is that you're open 24/7 and that all of your employees are gonna get 16 hours of overtime every single day. That is something you have to keep in mind. And those wages might be changed in order to accommodate all that overtime. So this is a possibility that you should be ready for now, just so you're mentally prepared for this existential situation that could occur at some point. Moving on from there. This is the thing that a lot of you aren't going to like, and it's definitely something they would do in order to create a registry and keep an eye on movement from within the population. Because one thing we have to be honest about when it comes to the possibility of global conflict and moving us into the point of a crisis where martial law is a necessity, you have to assume and be aware of the fact that the enemy could easily be on our own soil or have cells here within our own country at that time. So they're not going to just let everybody go around willy-nilly and not going to, let's just say, suspect that everybody has something they're hiding. So they're going to definitely want to look into people, keep an eye on people, and keep a registry of movement. And so civilian ID and fingerprinting becoming mandatory is definitely a possibility during martial law. And that is something you should definitely be prepared for now. Because if you don't want to be put into that registry, and you don't want your fingerprints to be taken, and you don't want to have some mandatory ID given to you by the military, you're going to have to find the best way you can to avoid having to interact with them at all. And that's going to be very difficult if you find yourself in a situation where you have to venture out to get supplies and food and everything else related to survival. And that is something we talk about in the preparedness community all the time, because if we don't have to have these interactions, we don't have to take risks. And during martial law, there's no reason for you not to be held against your will based on circumstance, based on possible situations, based on somebody's hunch. These things can easily happen during those times. And you don't want to find yourself on the wrong end of that and leaving your family behind from wherever you left them when you went out to go get supplies, and suddenly you just disappear off the face of the earth and they never hear from you again. And this is definitely a possibility during those times because they're not going to take any risks. And if you have any indication of being a risk, then you're probably going to be detained one way or the other. This is not what we want, okay? Some constitutional rights will still remain during a martial law scenario, but understand that the rectification process of fixing any constitutional violations will likely only happen after the fact, after the crisis is over, after martial law is no longer declared. And that is when things maybe start going through the courts and maybe start getting fixed, but that's if everything goes back to normal, and that's if the courts are not fully broken, and that's if you survive the situation that got you into the situation where you have to be rectified. So, do what you can now to avoid any interaction you don't have to have. Do what you can now to avoid having to go out and get supplies during a martial law scenario. And understand that historic precedent is there for martial law to be declared if some kind of large-scale conflict was to unfold. And we keep talking about it lately, especially with what's going on in Eastern Europe. And so there's no reason to assume that if things ever escalate in that direction, that we won't be dealing with the same situation as Hawaii during the 1940s. I wanted to bring this to your attention because it's something we have to consider, and it's something we should just be prepared for regardless of its likelihood. Because is it likely? Probably not. Is it possible? 100%. And if anything ever goes true SHTF on us, you better believe martial law is going to be tried out before they just give up. So be ready for it now. And do what you can to not have those risks or dangers you're going to have to take if you don't have what you need. I wanted you to have something to think about, and I want you to be ready for however all this global tension can possibly go, because at the end of the day, even if nothing happens, you're still going to be better off by having more, and by doing more, and by learning more. And that's just how it works. So without anything else to say about surviving martial law and whether or not you're ready for it, that's going to be it for Magic Prep.